Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I wish I was seeing you in person, but it is lovely to see you all virtually today. And on behalf of the University of California and the UC First Gen Coalition, thank you for tuning in to today for our closing session of the First Gen Virtual Symposium. I've heard that today, the word I heard was today has been on fire. And so I'm really excited for an opportunity to spend this closing session with you. My name is Sarah Whitley, and I serve as an Assistant Vice President with the Center for First Generation Student Success at NASPA. I'm honored to be moderating today's conversation, focused with a critical look at higher education's response to the needs of first generation college students. I often say that California is where some of the nation's best first gen work is happening, and we see that through today's engagement in this event, through the many first gen Forward and First Scholars institutions present, and the success of so many of your initiatives. Throughout this session, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions to our speakers by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can during our time together today. I am pleased to be joined by two outstanding colleagues today, and I'll spend a couple of minutes here introducing them, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So tuning in today from UC San Diego is Dr. Frances Contreras, a UC Berkeley alumna who serves as a professor in the Department of Education Studies and Associate Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Dr. Contreras' research focuses on issues of equity and access for underrepresented students in the education pipeline and on the role of public policy in ensuring student equity across the P20 continuum. We're also joined today by Dr. Kevin Graham, who serves as the University Innovation Alliance Fellow for UC Riverside. The University Innovation Alliance is a national coalition of public research universities committed to increasing the number and diversity of college graduates in the US. And fortunately, these two lovely panelists are going to allow me to engage with them a bit throughout our time together today. So to frame our conversation, we're going to consider the current context of higher education from multiple perspectives. To do this, it's important that we think about the student experience, research and scholarship, policy, and the bureaucratic systems that comprise higher education, and in many ways, to be honest, stunt the opportunities for first generation students to be successful. We must also acknowledge the current political, social, and economic climates, along with COVID-19, that shape our current efforts to support first generation students. As we all know, students attending higher education today face uniquely different challenges than those a few years ago, yet we continue to serve students through antiquated policies and processes and procedures. And so to help us unpack this important conversation, we're going to get started right there in that same vein with a discussion of the Higher Education Act. And so if our panelists are ready to get going, we're going to dive right in. And as we all know, the 1965 Higher Education Act was signed into law 55 years ago. And all of you good Californians and folks across the nation know November 8th was that day, National First Generation Celebration Day. And this was a part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society agenda, which had the main goal of eradicating poverty and racial injustice. So over 5 decades later, have we made good on those early promises, and in particular for first gen students? And so to get us started, I'm going to ask Frances if she'd like to jump in and let's talk a little bit about this big topic. We could spend all day on this one. I'm going to get started with you.
Right, right. And so thank you for having me here today. I'm going to give you a few statistics in a bit, but I thought it would be important to just say what an honor it is as a first generation student, scholar, professor to be with you today. I feel like this space is my home, and I'm really thrilled to be discussing these important topics with you today. So in terms of the Higher Education Act, I think that, what it has done for higher education is really initiate some early key policies, right? Like the Pell Grants, like Title I, like FAFSA, Gear Up. Many of you are, part of programs that are related to first generation students. The Higher Education Act did that in terms of, Title III, strengthening developing institutions. But fast forward to today, right? In a time when 41% of UC undergraduates are first generation, 47% of public four-year institutions, of students in public four-year institutions are first generation, and 65% of public two-year institutions are first gen. We know that access exists, right? And that's, I think, one of the important takeaways that I think the Higher Education Act helped to do in terms of public policy. But we know that we're not there yet, right? In terms of supporting the success of our first generation students nationally. I think at UC we're doing a good job, but I'd like to see that 80% turn into closer to 100%. And so as we think about the potential for public policy, it's important to know that with the changing demography in the country, right, with over 48% of our K-12 students of color, higher education still requires concerted efforts to serve students equitably. And I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thanks so much for kicking us off. I'm so grateful that you acknowledged that there were some good things that came out of it. And many of us have had such great experiences with programs like Gear Up and TRIO programs, but there's still a long way to go. So Kevin, did you have thoughts you wanted to share here?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first, let me just say that it is an honor to be here as a first gen graduate, as someone who has been a graduate of HOP programs and TRIO programs. I'm simply happy to be partaking in this conversation. So I'll add, and the stats, Francis, thank you so much. Those are important because we have made some progress, but we still have a mountain ahead of us. So the Higher Education Act, there are two pieces that I think are important, and I want to reify in this conversation. The first piece was to eradicate poverty, and the second piece was racial injustice. And I think we meaning higher ed, I think we still have a way to go, and I think we have fallen short. I think where we have made tremendous strides is as it relates to access. And I think that we haven't fully solved that issue yet, but there is inroads that have been made. Now, I'll jump into several things that I think that are noteworthy, and those things are some of the programs and initiatives that have been launched. Now, it is not strange to go on a college campus across the United States, so across state contexts, across institutional contexts, and see things like food pantries and first gen spaces, and book loaning programs and technology loaning programs. So I think to sort of tip the hat, I think we've done a fairly good job with regards to access, but I think we still have a mountain ahead of us as it relates to the racial injustice and the poverty piece, especially.
Great, thanks so much. And so I think the natural next step in that conversation is, where do we go from here? The mountain is ahead of us. And so how do we begin to continue to scale that mountain? Where do we go from here to make sure that we don't go another 5 decades and we hear a conversation that says, well, we've made little bits of progress, but not enough. What's next? What do you all think?
So, in terms of, what we can do better, I think that, as a faculty member, I always think about, the progress that's been made, and we focused on the student data. But the reality is that 75% of our faculty in higher education remains white, right? And professors, I'm going to give you my group, Latinas. So Latinos are 1% of the faculty that are full professors. 1%. If you're a Latina out there, shout out to you. Continue on with your PhD. You will join the 1% club that we need to increase that number. But it's 6% across all ranks for Latinos. For African Americans, it's 6% of faculty nationally. These numbers don't reflect the previous data that I pointed to in terms of the changing demography of our country. And what does that mean, right? It means that we need faculty that can relate to the students and their families, that can inspire the next generation. We need institutions to reflect communities. And if they reflect communities, they'll engage communities. I know that I navigate this space differently, potentially than my peers. That when I bring a student into the doctoral experience, that I bring them into, they're my advisee, they're part of my academic family. They become part of my academic, what I call familia. And I know a number of other scholars throughout the UC system, my sisters, right, in the struggle, see mentorship in the same way. And so I think concerted efforts need to be made in student success. But what I mean by student success is not only the outcomes, it's the journey, right? What does the journey look like? What are the experiences we're passing on to our youth and our young scholars that really do represent the best and brightest of our communities? And they will be the leaders of their generation.
Great. Yeah. Kevin, thoughts from you?
Oh, absolutely. So I think there's a long list of things that we can do better, but I won't go through the litany of that list. I will simply highlight several key areas. I think we can do a better job at disaggregating the data because, as we know, first-gen students, we're not a homogeneous population. And I think we should disaggregate the data, not to simply marvel at it, but I think we should disaggregate the data to personalized service. As we know, individuals' identity mobilize differently on campus context. And I say that because, take for example, a first-gen Black student. That student would navigate a campus differently than, say, for example, a first-gen undocumented or DACA student or first-gen LGBTQ plus student. And I think what we have, and what I mentioned earlier, is that we have access and we have services, and those things are great. But I think that when we disaggregate the data, it allows us to serve as students and stand up and establish resources with intentionality that speaks to the different facets of students' identity. And I think we need to do a better job at that. I think also loans and student debt. So I've spent the better part of this week doing interviews and collecting qualitative data with first-gen graduates. And one of the barriers that students cited resoundingly, one of the challenges to them persisting, was loans. Students are deathly afraid of loans and taking on loans and wondering and thinking through the prospect of, yes, college is great, but how am I going to pay for this? So I think we can do a better job at normalizing funding, normalizing spaces for first-gen students, as well as helping students to navigate the process.
Yeah, 100% agree. I really appreciated you bringing up the conversation about data. I spend a lot of time in my world talking about defining first gen. And the fact that we're still working through how institutions are defining, and of course, we have our TRIO programs using a definition. In California, we're seeing a lot of conversation about a new definition that includes the caveat of parents needing to be born in the United States to have that definition. And so I think we have a long way to go in actually understanding who our first gen students are. If you're interested in this topic, Wichita State University did a really nice job in the last couple of years of challenging their assumptions about who is first gen at their institution. They all had this idea in their head of the profile of that student, and they were pushing their students toward, pushing their programs and services toward a particular student. And they spent a lot of time in their data, as you suggest, and realized they were serving the whole wrong population and needing to really tweak and refine those resources. And so I appreciated that you brought that up as well. So let's see. So I think as we're thinking about that, that really moves us into another conversation that's really thinking about the pressing needs of first generation students. So in thinking about the unique spheres that you all represent today across research and policy and practice, what are the pressing needs of first generation college students that really need to be top of mind for educators today? I know sometimes I get overwhelmed by all the possible things we could be doing for first gen students, and kind of what are you really seeing as the things to keep top of mind?
You want to go ahead, Kevin, or you want me to take it first?
No, please, go ahead.
Okay. So when I think about, and I'm really glad that Kevin mentioned finance, I can speak to that later, but I think that because it was covered, I'm going to move on to my second point, which was curriculum. When I think about, conversations around racial justice and social justice and inequities, I really think we need to examine and critically examine and overhaul aspects of our curriculum in higher education. And when I think about, our faculty, being less diverse, I think it's really important that faculty critically reflect on their own practice, right? Right now in this virtual environment, how are you reaching out to students, for example? But with that, it means constantly revisiting what you teach, how you teach, how do you assess students, how do you measure student work? Are you using an asset-based approach with students? And if not, if you realize, for example, your department culture maybe fosters an approach that's not asset based, right, and that's deficit oriented towards students, what do you need to do to bring your faculty along, right? And so it calls for a level of leadership that we really haven't seen in a way that's been across departments, across fields, right, across systems. And I'll give you an example. The CSU recently adopted with the California legislature an ethnic studies, right, that they're going to have ethnic studies in as part of their undergraduate education requirement. The entire system is mobilized around providing ethnic studies courses and a requirement to their students. I think that we in the UC system and large public systems need to revisit one, not only providing courses, but how are our ethnic studies departments funded and supported? How are their faculty with the great, service that they provide? How are they? How do we serve them as well, right? How do we empower those departments and fully support their efforts? Because many of the ethnic studies departments across public systems are providing a great deal of service by teaching a lot of, or the majority of the DEI courses, right? Those diversity equity courses. And so just thinking about curriculum and how we do what we do on the pedagogical side, I think will go a long way as well to innovate and educate our students in ways that speaks to them, in a way that speaks to them.
Absolutely. I really appreciated two of the points that you made. Just thinking, we often hear a lot of first gen work and pressing needs related to student support services, and not just trio student support services, but student supports across the institution. And we often don't spend enough time talking about the academic experience for first gen students. And so I'll tell you, one of the top two questions I receive in the center almost every week is related to faculty and staff development around first gen, and how do we create better academic spaces and academic experiences in the classroom for research, and in a lot of ways. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. And I just wanted to highlight a really fantastic thing you said as you started there, was how do we begin to speak in an asset-based approach? And if the notion of being asset-based and dismantling deficit-based approaches is new to our audience today, I encourage you to dig in and learn more about that, because the more work that we can all do to dismantle this notion of deficit-based approaches, we're opening so many more doors for our students to be successful. And so appreciated your framing of that so early in the conversation. So Kevin, thoughts from you?
Oh, absolutely. So Francis, I appreciate that you went curriculum. So I will go services. So here are my thoughts. I think about the first gen journey, and I think about how first gen students are welcome to the institution. And in very many cases, and not all, in very many cases, we see services for first gen students front loaded. So think the first 2 years of them traversing the institution. And then at some point, think third, fourth year, the students experience a wane in services that they can count on. So think through things like students traversing employability in graduate school. I think that we need to sort of foster institutional capacity to assist students through every single phase of their journey. You don't graduate out of being first gen. So when you're hitting the job market, you're still first gen. When you are transitioning to graduate school or the work, you're still first gen. And in terms of what should be atop of our minds, I think through something that I learned in my time at ETS, Educational Testing Services. And that is the idea that there's no college without high school. And I'm tailoring that to the current context that we have, where students throughout in the K through 12 system, students, online and virtual education has been a challenge. And these are the students that are going to transition to higher education. So how are we preparing to intentionally welcome and support those students? Because the landscape is changing, the students' needs are changing. So those are some of the things that I've been actively thinking about, because not only do we need a continuum in institutional capacity, we need to be aware of the changes. And Francis, you mentioned this earlier, the demographics. Yes, higher education is experiencing a browning, as some people would experience the browning of higher education. And I think we ought to be mindful of that as well, and prepared to welcome students and partner with them in fostering what success looks like for them.
Great, thank you for that. You're getting a lot of love in the Q&A down there for one of your quotes. So we're going to circle back. And I wanted to make the note, we're seeing lots of great questions come in, and I'm taking those in, and we're going to start to filter those into the conversation. So know that we're hearing you, and we're going to continue to bring some of those pieces into the conversation. Yeah, appreciated kind of the services curriculum approach there. And I think we have to acknowledge that the first generation identity is so deeply intersectional. And that makes a difference in understanding who our students are, but also how we're supporting them. I mentioned earlier that we get a lot of questions in the center about faculty and staff development. The other question we get all the time is career preparation and post-completion planning. And how do we support students on the back end of the experience? And whether that's going off to the workforce, whether that's getting your first place to live out of college, whether that's going to graduate school. We know the first gen graduate student conversation is a huge topic, and really a big topic in the California space as well. So appreciate all of those kind of pieces and bringing all that together around that intersectional identity. So we're gonna keep this conversation moving. There's so much to cover in a short amount of time today. I wanted to start with Kevin on this question. But Kevin, if you were going to identify an area of opportunity or a promising practice that higher education institutions should really hone in on to improve support for first gen students currently in today's climate, what would that be for you?
Thank you so much for that question. So I'm going to highlight two areas. One would be, well, it's one area with sort of two prongs. So utility of technology. So using technology to introduce students, and the current climate which I'm thinking of actively is virtual learning and COVID, and not having a sense of when the COVID debacle will subside. So I think if we could find strategic ways to use technology to welcome students to campus and simultaneously utilize technology to help students to build community. And I'll share two things that my colleagues at UCR are currently working on that I'm especially proud of. One is the chatbot, which is a UIA project. But my colleagues at UCR, we've partnered around leveraging AI to help students get answers. And currently we have 5 key departments. So think housing, enrollment, financial aid, undergraduate education, and student business services. And we launched a chatbot, and I'm sharing this because I think it has some value and a case for technology. We launched a chatbot in June, J months, in June. And since June, that chatbot has had over 14,000 conversations and 33,000 interactions with students. And based on the sheer volume of qualitative data that we have been able to collect, we were able to see, and this, I think it's important for me to share the demographics of UCR. We're talking about an institution with over 58% of its student body being first gen, identifying as first gen. So what we were able to do is look at some of the questions that students were asking. You know, what is financial? What is FAFSA? What is financial aid? What is the bursar? And what my colleagues tactfully and strategically did was to build that AI with first gen jargon. So they operationalized a total of 250 words and uploaded that. So students got those answers. And we triaged the chatbot as well. So if a student needed to speak with someone to speak with someone from financial aid immediately, that student was put in touch. So that's one way in which we utilize technology to get a pulse of what students were experiencing. I'll share a second piece of technology that I'm happy that one of my colleagues has been launching and successfully. So this idea of community, when we did focus groups with students, we saw and heard the need for community. And what my colleagues did was they launched Mentor Collective. And I'm happy to share that with the incoming class, over 30% of the incoming class has been enrolled in Mentor Collective. So I think that there is a real case to be made to utilize technology to welcome students and to build community, and to also build curricula and pedagogy that highlights and illustrates that it is possible, one, community, and two, that students are welcomed here. So how are we using technology to do that?
That's fantastic. That's really interesting data that you have coming out of some of your new initiatives. And I think you're right. Community means sense of belonging, and sense of belonging is a really great way for students to decide how they're going to solve a problem, and they choose to stay at the institution. So love hearing that. And as we're thinking about resource sharing within the chat and the Q&A section, if your institution's doing really interesting work with technology or supporting students, drop some of that in there. We'd love to see what all the good things that are happening. Francis, your thoughts on this big question?
Yes, yes. So what works? When I think about, my pathway to and through higher education, I think back to those early days of going from not even knowing where Berkeley was, right, on a map, to, you know, engaging in a journey that was foreign to, right, my entire family. And I know that I've had some really critical pivotal moments, and one of those was through a program called McNair. And many of you know about McNair. It's a small program that engages you, it allows the student to engage in research. And I think about that cohort of 30 students that were all students of color, some of my closest friends, who are all faculty except for one. One is a CEO, multi-mega investor in bioinformatics. But 29 of them became faculty members, and I still work with a few of them today. But I think about programs like McNair and exposing me to my then mentor, Rachel Moran at Cal, who was an assistant professor of law at the time, because I thought I wanted to go into law school. Rachel was amazing. She met with me weekly. She reviewed my work. She gave me the time. But if I hadn't had that pivotal moment and those fortuitous, what I call fortuitous experiences, and other individuals and scholars have written about pivotal moments, there's a whole literature on that. Um, then I'm not sure if I would have chosen the faculty route. And so the challenge is, how do we make sure that programs like McNair and Trell and Summer Stars are part of the curriculum? They're part of the curricular experience and not happenstance, right? They're not part of these fortuitous moments that you have along your journey. You're still going to have them, but what's our responsibility to really create those infrastructures so that more students beyond the 30 have the opportunity to become leading scholars? And so that's really what I spend my time doing. On my own campus, we have programs like Summer Stars. I know Lindsay is on this call and helped to organize this event, Lindsay Romasanta. She knows very well. Summer Stars. We have Summer Trails. We have, a number of different, McNair, of course, during the summer. And the program directors know that if someone is, if a student is said no to, right, which our faculty often do, they say no for the summer experience, they're going off or they're traveling or whatever reasons they give the student. These staff members know that I will not say no. And so I have large teams in the summer. I have 7 to 8 students at any given time. And this past summer was no different, but I engaged them in interviews and rigorous research online. And I think that we have to tell one another that no is not an option, right? That with these numbers that we see throughout the UC system and throughout the country, we all have to roll up our sleeves and do our part to make sure that we are making these research experiences and opening the doors to the world of research, to everyone, especially our first gen students who don't know the pathway.
Yeah. I loved when you just said no is not an option. I think there was a conversation in here about putting some of these quotes on a T-shirt, and I think no is not an option. When it says, "How are you going to support first gen students?" No is not an option. You have to do this work, and so I really appreciate your thoughts there. And you really spoke to something that I think about a lot, and that's how we've really siloed the first gen experience. That we often are serving very small pockets of students, and if you didn't know about that opportunity the summer before you started, you didn't know about that opportunity, it's very happenstance. You fall into these opportunities and they change their lives. I met with a student at UT Arlington about a year ago who said to me, "Can I give up my place in Trio so my roommate can have it? Because I feel like I've gotten the resources and now I want my friends to have this great experience." That is not how we should be serving students. And so, as I was thinking about this question quickly, I wanted to just share a couple of things that we've learned in a lot of the national work that we do through the center. And as I thought about this question, I thought about it in 3 parts. One was strategic. And how do you network your approach at the institution? How do you share resources and create partnerships? We spend a lot of time putting students in these little boxes and putting those boxes in particular offices, and we don't do a great job of connecting resources throughout a community. And so I think that's a place that we're always seeing good work. From practice, a lot of people will ask me, where do I start? What do I do? I'm a person in an office. Where do I start? And often the response to that is with auditing. Audit your policies and your practices and your procedures, and work with students to do that. Dig into the jargon. Kevin, you were mentioning all the jargon work you all did with your chatbot. But creating, and that's the easiest way to start to dismantle those systemic barriers, is to do it within the space in which you have some control, and then move beyond there and beyond there. And so really thinking a lot about that. And then the last thing I thought about was external. Um, I always am sad to see that a lot of institutions don't do a good job with creating success narratives around first gen and all the wonderful things that are happening and the great things that students are doing. And when they're not doing that, they're not also connecting it to a development officer. Where do you start to have these conversations about, here's all the work we're doing, here are the great things our students are doing, they're amazing, they're doing research, it's fantastic, but then you're not actually using it to go after dollars, to go after opportunities for grants. And so that's a place that I think we could really be doing more for the first gen population, to help support some of our efforts as well. And maybe to get some of those t-shirts funded that seem to be really popular. Comment over here in the chat as well. So know we're getting a little tight on time. And so I'm going to keep moving us forward a little bit. I have one more question for you all, and then I'm going to see what we have over here in the chat. And so as educators, as thought leaders, members of the first gen community, what are ways that we can stay accountable to keeping first gen college students in the center of everything we do amid all these competing priorities? And so Frances, I'll kick it over to you to start off on that one.
Sure. I know we're running short on time, so I'm just going to try to make this one brief. And that is, I think that we always talk about data, but we have a lot of data we don't use. And so thinking about, critically examining data on our campuses, looking at UQs, how are our students navigating our institutional environments differently, right? We need to take a pulse on the climate. We need to identify mechanisms for improvement. On my campus, thanks to our EDI office and the Vice Chancellor, she has initiated a Latinx Academic Excellence Initiative and a Black Academic Excellence Initiative. And in these two initiatives, we have two faculty, staff, student-led groups that are examining, how particular student groups and ethnic groups are navigating our campus. And so with that, thinking about these questions like, are there gatekeeper courses within specific majors? Are there gatekeeper majors? Right? Are there problematic departmental climates that are hostile to first generation students? And how do we work with faculty and departments to alter practices and approaches to pedagogy? How do we reach out to faculty so that they critically examine their practice, right, and their craft? And I think that, we need to remind each other that if we're serving first generation students well, we're serving everyone, right? We're serving all of our students if we're serving our first generation students well.
Yeah, what's good for first gen is good for everyone. And so it's always a great mantra to have in the back of your mind. Kevin, your thoughts on this?
Yes, and brevity will be my friend on this one. I would offer listening. And I know it's a very, 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 specifically listening to students. And I know it's a very, very simple thing. But to quote Twain here, simplicity can sometimes be the greatest sophistication. And I think the art and the tact of listening has been made even more sophisticated and complex because of the COVID context. Remember, students are outside of the academy currently. They are engaging with higher education from their living rooms and other spaces. And especially students who are transitioning now and learning how to navigate. In very many ways, the onus is on them. But I think as a field, I think we can position our ears to students, because oftentimes students tend to be the expert on their issues. And I think we can learn a great deal about how to serve students based on the feedback that they're giving us. For example, with the chatbot, one thing that we did was we listened to students, and we saw that students were struggling to understand the jargon. We also listened to students when they said that study groups is a big thing. They wanted to learn how to come to community, and they felt that coming to community should be something that was orchestrated by faculty in terms of classes. So we offered that as feedback, and now it is a pedagogical practice for faculty to sort of scaffold that community study group. So I think we would be doing a great disservice to ourselves not to listen to students, and to Francis' point, to utilize the data that we already have. Students have consistently given us a corpus of data around how they would like to be serviced. I do think that now is the time to deliver on it. If not now, then when? And to everyone listening, I would say, if not you, then who?
Awesome. So we have a question that's come in through our audience, and so I want to make sure we take a couple of minutes to dig into that one, and then we'll wrap up with some closing comments. I wish we had about 3 more hours for this conversation. So the question from our audience member is lack of local, state, and federal support, so money and resources in higher education and really in general, is falling on the backs of students, and particularly first-gen students, via skyrocketing fees and cost of attendance. How do we demand that this dramatically and drastically change? Big question.
I mean, one word response is vote, right? We have to vote for our interests. I mean, we did this past election, but honestly, I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of, contributing to policy discourse around college for all policies, right? It shouldn't only be, we should all adopt this. What does it mean to have a college for all policy? What does it mean to subsidize higher education? And how do we put individuals in office that can respond to the needs of our students and the changing students of today?
Kevin, thoughts from you?
Um, I agree with that sentiment of the idea that it is falling on students. And I think that one thing we can do is I think we ought to, in some way, shape, or form, prioritize funding towards the student population. I think what's been so insightful, to be quite honest, about COVID-19 is we've seen, because sometimes higher ed has, well, not even sometimes, the going critique of higher ed is that it's bureaucratic, and sometimes it can be slow. But in very many ways, higher ed has been quite nimble right now, in some ways. And I think that we ought to mobilize that level of nimbleness and creative thinking towards this student population, because I think it is possible. And I think it is possible to fund students. I do think it needs to be an institutional imperative that we take some of that burden off of students. And I'll just share this. In interviewing and collecting data from the first gen graduates, many of those students shared that had I known that a particular scholarship existed or a particular grant existed, I would have pursued that. It did not become on my radar. It did not go on my radar until third or fourth year. And by then my priorities were different. So some of it even is making those sort of nuanced opportunities more transparent to students. So what I'm doing in this response is I'm putting the onus back on the institution to think and be strategic about how they unfold financial opportunities to students.
Absolutely. I think you made some really incredible points. I was in a conversation this morning just about how do we fund higher education differently? How do we think about foundation engagement, particularly for our HBCUs, our MSIs, our HSIs, our tribal institutions? How do we think differently about creating these opportunities? But Kevin, I think we went to an earlier point that you made about how to, and I think in Francis's work as well, the P12, P16, P20 pipeline. How are we thinking about getting these opportunities in front of students a lot earlier? I do a lot of work with Florida State University, and they have first-gen trained admissions counselors in the Florida high schools talking about these opportunities earlier and earlier and earlier. But really, it's a structural issue that we have to overcome to think about this differently. And I will say I am holding out a lot of hope with the Biden administration's announcement of their education team this week. I am hopeful we may see some good things in the days and weeks and months to come. All the fingers and toes crossed on that one. And so as we wrap up our time together today, I'm going to give each of you about 30 seconds to just share a last piece of advice, a charge to our audience. Folks are here with us today because they want to do this work and they want to do it really well. And so would love to hear what you all would like to share with the group as we move forward.
Closing thoughts from me. I think now is the time to innovate, honestly. And it's not just for me. It's not just a buzzword or one of those attractive things that you put out there in terms of higher ed language. I think the current climate demands innovation. It would be foolhardy for us to continue to use old methods. I think what we're hearing from students is their needs have changed. And I think if we are practitioners, if we're researchers and educators, I think it's time for us to take a word based on what this section is called. It's time for us to evolve in our practice, evolve in our thinking, and for us to continue to push the ball because higher ed is bureaucratic, again. But I think that the individuals who are listening and those of us who are gathered here, I think we have the capacity to do that work. And every little effort, every little bit of effort matters. Take it from someone who is a first gen student. The fact that someone advocated for an EOP program and a mentorship program at my institution mattered to me. And for me, I'm looking and I'm asking you all to innovate and create things that will matter to a future generation. I'll end there.
Great. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. So, in terms of my closing thoughts, I mean, I think about, the fact that we need to remember that we're all part of this journey. This past year, I hit a milestone and became a full professor, and I'm driving down the street with my two little kids and had my music blaring, feeling just this moment. And we're talking about dreams, right? And the importance of dreaming. The kids, always tell me what they want to be. They have to do these exercises for school. And I remember conveying the importance of dreams. And I give them a rhetorical question, what happens when you're at a stage in your life and you've really achieved everything you've set out to achieve, like you've achieved your dreams? And my 9-year-old son turns to me and like he asked me to lower the music and says, Mom, it means it's time for some new dreams. And, from the mouth of a 9-year-old, I think that in this time and space, I think we need to approach first generation students with a sense of urgency, with a sense of collective investment. And if each of us, right, provides the space, the time, the opportunity for a first generation cohort body of students to dream, then we have engaged in that pathway along with them, that we have, helped them along their journey to impacting our communities.
It sounds like you've got a pretty smart son there, and thinking about us all needing to continue our dreams. And I think a lot of times at the crux of the work we're trying to do with first gen students is we're trying to give them an opportunity to follow their dreams. And that's a noble cause that I think we can all get behind. I've talked a lot lately with colleagues about this being the time to double down on first gen, that we are in a space with COVID, we're in a space with racial injustice, we're in a space just in our world with the structural issues in higher ed, that our leadership needs to double down on first gen. It's time for our partners, even just to see a growth in businesses and organizations hiring first gen students with intentionality. And so I hope we're we're in kind of a precipice of something really incredible happening, as we really need to spend time doubling down. And anything anyone in our audience can do today to work with their senior leadership, with their partners, to help us make first gen a focus at the institution is such an important one. And by just being here with us today, we're all doing that. So before I wrap up for the day and offer us a couple of closing comments from the team, huge thank you to Francis. Huge thank you to Kevin. Looks like y'all are getting some friends here in the chat. So I think you're gonna be hearing from some folks as we wrap up. But on behalf of the University of California and the UC First Gen Coalition, thank you so much for joining us for this closing session. It was a pleasure to connect virtually with each of you today, and we appreciate you making time to be a part of today's event. And we hope you've gained some valuable wisdom to continue to be change makers for first gen students. I'd like to thank again our panelists for their generosity and commitment. Really valued the conversations. Really great stuff in the chat there too. Hope you all will consider submitting a manuscript to the New Journal of First Gen and get involved in programs and services. And for me personally, if the center can ever be of help to any of the work that you all are doing, reach out, let us know. That's why we're here. I hope you'll take some time to provide feedback on today's event following the survey gizmo link that appeared on your screen after you launched today's webinar. And the feedback will be used to have future symposiums. And I hope that means I'll be on a plane to California pretty soon to see you all in person. And we hope to see you all at the after party here in just a couple of minutes. Thanks again, stay safe and enjoy your weekend.